Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's online summit, How .NET MAUI Changes the Cross-Platform Game. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Visual Studio Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to DevExpress for their sponsorship of this event. DevExpress, specializing in software technology research, component, and add-ins creation for a range of platforms. Without them, this event would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the first of two information-packed sessions. But before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. This session is will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time throughout the talk. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors provide some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. At the end of this session, you'll be asked to take a short survey. We know you guys are busy, but we'd really appreciate it if you just take a moment to give us some honest feedback about today's events. We use it to improve things as we go forward. And last but not least, at the end of the the second session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $300 Amex gift card. Come in handy over the Christmas shopping season. But you must be with us to win, so stick with the program. Now let's get started with our first session, transitioning from Xamarin.Forms to .NET MAUI, key takeaways. For this session, we've called on Microsoft MVP Mitchell Sellers, founder and CEO of Iowa Computer Gurus, a leading provider of custom application solutions built on Microsoft .NET technology stack. Mitchell is a 15-year Microsoft MVP, and he has given more than 400 conference presentations on software development practices to audiences of all sizes. He is well known for his focus on information that provides immediate real-world value to attendees. I know you guys are in for a great session. Take it away, Mitchell.
Awesome, thank you. Appreciate the introduction and great to be here for everybody. So to start out, we're really talking about the transition process from Xamarin.Forms to .NET MAUI. And I think it's important before we get into any of the specific details here that we look at the exact state of where things are today for developers in the Xamarin world. Ultimately, the most important detail is that Xamarin.Forms support from Microsoft ends officially on 5/1 of 2024. Now, as we look at what that means, we have to look at what happens. So Xamarin.Forms support ending on 5/1/2024 means that the current versions, which most recently were released on October 10th of 2023, are the last versions of Xamarin.Forms that are planned by Microsoft. At this point in time, that means that we have support for Android API 34 and Xcode 15 SDKs, which translates to iOS and iPadOS 17, as well as Mac OS 14. Now, these are the final targets. There's no plans, there's no support for Microsoft in necessarily moving beyond those targets. So as we look at things from a development perspective, we also had Xamarin.Forms with some patch releases on August 10th. So we have absolutely recent releases, but we do have a situation where we have to figure out where do we go. Applications aren't going to stop working when you reach May 1st of 2024. However, you are going to be sitting on borrowed time because it's important for us to understand what is going to happen next in the mobile development space. So Android 15, which most likely is going to involve API level 35, is scheduled to come out in Q3 of 2024. iOS 18 is also going to be expected in Q3 of 2024. Where that puts us is specifically looking at the App Store minimum targets. If we look at the absolute drivers of when do things become critical, we have to look at when does life completely end. Yes, not supported by Microsoft, that's an important date, but we also had to look at how far away is our date that our apps aren't going to work. And really what we're looking at here is when the stores have minimums that become a problem. So we are seeing that the app stores are getting far more aggressive in pushing developers to build and target against the latest and greatest APIs. They're spending a lot of time, energy, and effort to add new functionality, new features to these APIs and application development platforms. They want to make sure that you are built in a way where you're able to leverage those as much as possible. So Google Play, for example, just recently updated the minimum target for new and updated apps to be an API level 33, so just one level below where Xamarin.Forms support is. Now, the secondary piece and an important thing to understand from a Microsoft perspective is support ends on 5/1/2024, but there's a little asterisk next to that, and that is as long as the tools don't break. So if they go and do something that you're not able to work with, or they make an update or some sort of a change where Xcode doesn't work or anything like that, you may be out of luck a little bit sooner. So absolutely something to be considered on and looking at with your applications of, where do you go from here? You're still going to be able to compile and everything should still be able to work consistently. We have to make sure we're considering what things happen from a app store perspective. Now, before we get into the specifics of actually doing the upgrade, it's important to take a look at where your applications are today. As we look at preparing for the updates, it is something that, a lot of times we've found that development teams haven't necessarily stayed up to date with all of the different versions of Xamarin.Forms. Some of the changes and migrations, especially from Xamarin.Forms 3 to 4, 4 to 5, there were some breaking changes, and some of those things weren't necessarily the most friendly. So we found that a lot of people have been hanging back at Xamarin.Forms 4, or they've been, hanging back in older versions. I really, really cannot stress enough: upgrade to the latest version of Xamarin.Forms as a first step. Also, while doing that, remove any build warnings, any unused code, any of those things that you've kind of just been putting off is something that I think will really help with all of the upgrades that we've done, with all of the transitions that we've been able to do. We want to make sure that we're getting rid of those things that might become errors in the later scenario. We want to remove code that maybe isn't necessarily part of it because it makes some of this process a lot easier to manage. One of the biggest examples that we've seen is sometimes people had old renderers or old things that, oh gosh, this was the workaround that we had to do back in Xamarin 3, and Xamarin 4 supported something, or Xamarin 5 supported something, and they didn't remove some of those things that were there. And so what can happen is that unused code results in you thinking, oh my gosh, my application's broken, I can't get this to work, I can't get it to compile. Yet all you needed to do was delete it because it wasn't used. So it is really, really imperative when you look at your applications and the things that you're doing to try to make sure that you're able to get to that latest and greatest version and make sure that you're able to move forward. Now, as we move forward and start to change our technology mindset from Xamarin.Forms over to .NET MAUI, I think it's really important for everyone to understand some of the architectural differences and project structure differences as it relates to the way that .NET MAUI works in comparison to Xamarin.Forms. This right here is a architecture diagram. It was published by Microsoft as how the Xamarin.Forms system is laid out. And what you're able to see in this process is that you have your shared application code. This is your app as you've created it within inside of Visual Studio. Typically, it's going to be named with your app name. And then on the left side here, you have your app.android project. So if my app was named app, we would have app.android. That is your one project that you build when you're trying to target Android. When you're wanting to start your app with your emulator, you need to be inside of that project. And that contains then all of your Android specific bits. Your common code, common pieces there are inside of your app structure. And then over here on the right, you would have your app.ios, which is the iOS variant of your application. So almost every single project that you would have in Xamarin.Forms is always going to have at minimum 3 projects: app, app.android, app.ios. This is your minimum setup and your basic configuration. as we go to .NET MAUI and we look at the infrastructure and layout, Microsoft shows this as .NET, .NET MAUI, and then down below it, we have iOS, Android, macOS, and Windows. If you're following the latest and greatest and the best recommendations from .NET MAUI, if you do File, New Project in the in your Visual Studio instance and don't take into consideration anything you're coming from, you're going to be in a single project architecture. You're going to have a single CS proj file. Within that single CS proj file, you're going to be able to simply say, I want to start my app on Windows. I want to start my app on iOS via an emulator. I want to start my app on an iOS device via connection. Right? If you're on a Windows device, you can do connection either by remotely going to a Mac, or you can do it by having your iPhone plugged in through iTunes on your individual developer workstation. Now, the reason I bring this up is this new architecture in comparison to the old architecture poses some things that you want to consider when you are working on your transition. It is absolutely possible to create a .NET MAUI application that still follows the 3-project architecture that exists within Xamarin.Forms. However, developer convenience and consistency and a lot of the new fancy things that we get in the .NET MAUI world only exist if you upgrade your product architecture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why that single project architecture solution within MAUI is so important for developers to consider as you're doing your transition. So one of the first things that we have is the debug targeting. It's a single dropdown. You only have one project. There's no, oh gosh, I ran this the wrong way. I hit F5 and I went to somewhere I didn't want to go. I didn't have the right project structure set up. This is a really, really fast developer productivity thing. Hot Reload is all integrated with all of this as well. So you can make changes and all of those kinds of things really, really easy to do your debugging. Asset and resource management, I think, is the number one thing in the single project architecture that is just absolutely amazing. In .NET MAUI, it is possible for you to store the resources centrally, and they are automatically packaged for distribution for you based on your build targets. So you create one file that is your app icon, one file. And when you do your compilation to work with an iOS device, .NET MAUI is automatically going to resize that for you to create everything necessary to work with that application. So all of the different variants, all of the different sizes, all of the things that you need for that, handled for you automatically by you providing one image. That image is then also used automatically in Android. One of the biggest things that I've seen across development teams that exist in the Xamarin.Forms world is not necessarily updating things in both places. Oh, I updated this image. Oh shoot, we didn't update the Android version. So it's a really big thing. It reduces your project sizes. It reduces the number of image assets. It also makes sure that you get the right pixel densities and sizes. I absolutely also say that from a developer perspective, it's a lot easier. For those of us that have been doing Xamarin development for a long time, the app icon changes. If you accidentally choose the wrong one or you get that app icon bundle messed up, you can spend a lot of time debugging and fighting the tooling. You also get a single application manifest for the basic information. So your app title, your app ID, your version information, all of that's controlled from within a single manifest. That manifest is then utilized and blended together with app-specific targeting information. So the things that you need for Android and everything else are blended. This makes automation, things that you work with Azure DevOps for your builds or things that you might do with GitHub Actions, a lot easier to manage because you're updating one central location, especially a version. And it even fully supports passing the version number in as a command argument into your builds. We then still have all of the support, though, for an Android manifest and iOS manifest and the things that you need to do within the application. Anything platform specific, instead of being in a separate solution within Visual Studio, is simply done using a platforms folder grouping So there's a platforms folder, and then there's an Android folder, there's an iOS folder, there's a Windows folder. So you can still have things that are only included on the Windows device. You can have things that are only included in iOS. If you need to bring in specific plugins or anything like that, native components, you can still do all of those things just inside of a single project. As you go forward, Microsoft has outlined 3 primary upgrade paths. And I wanted to put these out here. I created tiny URLs for each of these so that you can go out and take a look at the 3 different pieces of guidance that Microsoft has. And we're going to talk through each of these options and some of the pros and cons of each of them. But they outline the upgrade assistant, which many people think is an automatic upgrade. We'll talk about that in a second. You have the manual multi-project upgrade, which is essentially taking your Xamarin.Forms multi-project structure and migrating that into a .NET MAUI multi-project structure. And then we have the manual single project update. So that's where you're taking a existing Xamarin.Forms application and trying to migrate that into the single project within .NET MAUI. As we look at each of these options, it's important to take a look at what the prerequisites are, what the steps are going to look like in setting expectations. So from an upgrade assistant perspective, this is the first thing. This is where almost everybody goes to. Those of us that have been around .NET for a long time, we're used to the upgrade assistance or some of the automatic Visual Studio upgrades where, oh, you open up a project in a new version of Visual Studio. It's like, hey, let me help you with that. It is recommended by Microsoft that you're upgraded to Xamarin.Forms 5. So this is where my original recommendation here of updating your dependencies is so important. They then provide you 2 different options. They provide an in-place option and a side-by-side option. It's important to really think about what you're trying to do and where you want to go with your application as to understand where that in-place option or side-by-side comes into play. So an in-place option is basically everything that you would think it is. It is going to simply update everything exactly as it is. So if a XAML file needs to be updated, it's going to be manipulated where it is as it is, and you'll be able to, continue to work to try to get things built. Side-by-side actually takes a complete copy of your application and puts it into a folder nearby, leaving the existing application code in place. A side option gives you an ability to kind of test what's going on, or might be utilized in a couple of other things that we'll talk about a little bit later. If you're looking for that longevity, that change tracking, making sure that your Git history shows you all of the different things that you might want to do, I would strongly suggest looking at doing things with a the side by side or the in place so that you get that Git version history. Because if you do things in another manner, you may not be able to get everything that you're looking for all at the same time. So what does this process do? It updates your project types. So your existing Xamarin.Forms projects are most likely not SDK-styled projects. It updates those project types. It changes the common references and fixes known breaking changes. So things that it's doing there is it's changing references to Xamarin Essentials and Xamarin.Forms over to their new equivalents in .NET MAUI. It's changing for known breaking changes with name changes or namespace changes and everything within your projects. However, it's important to understand that it doesn't migrate you over to the new project structure type. You're always going to still be with your 3 project bit, and you have to run the upgrade assistant on each of the project types to be able to do it. So you're going to run the upgrade assistant 3 separate times. It does not run on the solution itself. It runs on each of those individual projects. The other thing that it doesn't do is it 99.9% of the time does not result in a project that will compile or run or debug. And I think this is the most important thing for folks to understand with this upgrade path is that it is a great tool. It is to help you with some of the tedious knowing stuff, the things that you might try to do via find and replace. But it is not something that there should be an expectation that you run this and then click F5 and test your app to make sure that it works. There's just too many variables, too many differences when we look at the way that Xamarin.Forms works and the way that everything works with the upgrade assistance. So if we look at this and try to break it down into a pro-con scenario, the upgrade assistant absolutely helps you with the automated changes, especially for NuGet package references, things that, namespaces that have changed, right? Xamarin Essentials is moved to something else, even the community toolkit, some of those kinds of things. So absolutely helps you there. It lets you do the side-by-side or in place, which is also nice to be able to do compare and contrast and kind of look at what's going on. But it's not an upgrade experience. It is an upgrade assistant. It is absolutely not a migration tool or an automation piece. It requires a lot of manual effort, and you don't gain any of those benefits of the single project architecture. So really what you're doing is you're bringing that older project forward into something that is new. Now, Microsoft provides guidance for manually upgrading to multi-project. As you can imagine, the manual upgrade steps that are provided by Microsoft are essentially the one-off steps that are taken by the tool. So same prerequisite recommendations of upgrading to Xamarin.Forms 5. What they recommend that you do is you create a new project to replace your Xamarin project. So they actually have you go out and do file new project and create a new project. And then you manually move your files over one by one. So you grab the old XAML file, you move it over, you change all of the references. You grab the next file, you move it over and make those changes. Any of your things that are there are hundreds upon probably thousands of changes that you need to make for namespaces, packages, project types, and those kinds of things. So it is absolutely a bit of a tedious process. At the end of the day, you can use find and replace to help with a lot of this. Microsoft did a really good job in the documentation of providing you, here's what it used to be, here's what it is now, so that we have a really solid listing of those changes. Now, if we look at this, what's nice is you don't have that awkward, what did the automation do? You aren't sitting there and struggling with a way of understanding like what was changed, what wasn't changed. It's less confusing and far more repeatable if you have multiple projects. One of the things I like to say with the manual process is you can take and move over the foundational pieces of your application. You can then bring over, say, the splash screen and then the application homepage. You can then run your app, get the thumbs up that you were able to bring things over and be successfully working, and then rinse and repeat. So it allows you to get to a stage where you have a runnable application, probably a little bit faster, and allows you to be able to do a couple of things overall in a manual process. So with all of that, you'll be able to run through that process and update your application and be able to work through all of the different things that you might need to accomplish along the way. More than likely, this process is going to be faster for any existing development teams to transition to rather than transitioning over to a single application project. The single project is going to require you to make a lot of changes to images and some of your assets and resources, which we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But it is important for you to kind of look at where you want to go. Ideally, if you are in a situation where you need to do something quickly, the manual update process is probably going to be your fastest. So as you start to look at your development timeline, if the app stores start to make a bigger change and you need to do something really, really quickly, I think that the manual process and staying multi-project is probably going to get you to the net time as quick as possible without having to really stress or worry too much about the process. Now, if we take a look at some of the things that we get here in comparison to the upgrade assistant, you're going to see that we have a really manual process. You don't get a lot of functional gain. You're not, it's not any different. You're not resulting in any of your code being more clean or more ready for the future. You're not getting any new developer efficiencies. So a lot of times what I will recommend to folks is give the upgrade assistant a shot, see where the application looks, time box what you're doing, and make that determination between the upgrade assistant and manually doing things based on the success of that upgrade assistant. We have had some projects that the upgrade assistants got us 99% of the way there, and we spent an hour making some additional changes, and we were able to get those projects upgraded without any hassle. However, we've also had other ones where the upgrade assistant made so many changes that awkward "what did it do" scenario put us into a situation that we're not going to be able to really address or manage or manipulate things in a way that's reasonable for us. So the other thing that you get with here is, like I said, you're not really able to leverage all of those single project benefits. And I think as we look at where people want to be, where your organizations want to be as a long-term scenario, I think it's absolutely imperative that you get to that new single project structure. I think as we look at what Microsoft is doing and where things are going, the tooling is built around single project. If you do file new project, you're going to get a single project. So ultimately, if we want to plan ahead, we really need to take a look at our single project updates. Now, as we get into a single project update, this is the part that is really hard to wrap your head around because ultimately, we still have some of the same prerequisites. We need to upgrade to Xamarin.Forms 5.0. Microsoft's guidelines is to go file new project as a starting point, naming it exactly the same. So if your application is named app, you're going to create a new project named app. You're going to need to put that project in a different location than where you are. Obviously, you're going to overwrite what you have. And then we go through, just like what we were doing in the multi-project scenario, we're going to move your code over one by one, but you're going to move them into the new structure. So instead of moving it one file at a time into the Android project or into the iOS project, you're going to be taking your code that was a specific Android manifest, and instead of it being in the Android project, you're going to go into the single project structure, and you're going to be in the platforms folder for Android. You are going to be taking the iOS manifest or any asset declarations or anything like that from your project and moving those from a prior location over to the new location. Now, along with this, you have to also manage your resources and images to meet the single project requirement. This is the biggest thing where a new project example and looking at the documentation is going to be really critical for you, because your old image icons, your old app icons, your icon sets that you use for iOS, your icons that you're using for Android, you may not actually have the right image asset in your existing Xamarin.Forms project because of the new concept of how things work in .NET MAUI with the single project and images automatically being resized. Now you can turn some of those features off, but we lose a lot of that value. So it's really important when you're doing this manual upgrade process into the single project that you really need to look at the right image to keep. Don't just go into your app icon set for an iOS application and simply select the first app icon, or don't just select the 1024 icon, because that might not be the icon that allows you to be able to migrate things over into the proper single project solution. Ultimately, the goal there is to be able to benefit from this. Fonts are another consideration. In the single project solution, fonts can be loaded to a specific font folder within your assets. And the build process is going to take care of automatically taking those fonts and putting them in the right location. Android, for example, needs your fonts to be in a specific place. iOS needs them to be in another location. So that process for you is going to be automatic. You may have duplicates. You may have differences. And it is something that we've definitely caught in applications where a font was expected to be the same between Android and iOS, but a developer mistake or something in the past resulted in things not quite being where they are. Now, as we look at this process, it's trying to understand the benefits here. Why would I go this route? Why would I be taking this extra time manually to go through and do things? Ultimately, you upgrade and match the current project architecture. Your project works the same as a file new project.NET MAUI application. Your developer experience is the same as if you bring on a new developer to your team. They're going to be able to run things exactly how the Microsoft documentation says. This, for me, is an absolute business case sell. Being able to be on the same project solution type as Microsoft, as the documentation, as file new project has always been a gold standard for me with almost every single thing that we have. Things are evolving so fast that if you match the Microsoft standard, you're reasonably assured that when .NET 9 comes out or .NET 10 comes out, that there's a clean and clear pathway forward for you to be able to leverage the exact same features, the exact same benefits and things that are utilized by Microsoft in those solutions. If you diverge from this process with that multi-structure, it's a workaround if you really look at it. The other thing that we get with this is we reduce the project size with this single project. As I look at the projects that we've migrated from Xamarin.Forms over to .NET MAUI and gone single project, the total number of files, the size on disk, the number of assets that we're managing have been reduced by typically 60 to 70%. And it seems really silly, but it's all of those different device-specific architecture images, those things that you had to do. You had to go out to the app icon builders or wherever you go, right, to get a whole icon pack just to be able to get your app icon. Then you had to go out and get on the extra high resolution and this kind of thing. With all of those things being converted down to a single asset, you have a font in one place instead of a font in multiple places. You have other assets in one place instead of multiple. This is a huge benefit from a time developer experience and other solution. Your build process is a little bit easier as well because you have, overall a better developer experience. You have a single command that you can build, and you simply pass in from a build automation perspective. I want to build to this target framework. I want to build to iOS. I want to build to Android. I want to build to Windows. You no longer have to write a build process that is, this needs to build this project. This needs to build that project. So when you look at the complexity of updating your Azure DevOps pipelines, as you look at the complexity of updating your GitHub Actions, you're not going to see nearly as much work necessary here. Now, as we look at this process, the really thing that becomes hard is how tedious this process is. You are making all of those decisions. If you have an application that has a large number of assets, you may need to make substantial changes. You may need to reduce images, find the right number of images. We have an application that we moved recently that was a card game. And even just with card images, right, we have 52 card images, and you had them in different sizes and aspect ratios for each of the Android bits. So we had just over 400 images that ended up having to be manipulated. That became really, really tedious. It was something that was really hard for us to be able to kind of get things moving and adjust. But at the end of the day, that ultimate experience typically works well. The other piece that is often overlooked from a developer perspective is that your change tracking history is effectively lost. And this really actually applies to both of the manual upgrade processes. If you are aware of how Git works or whatever you're using for source control, most of them have the same limitation. If you're copying a file from one location to another and you're not using specific commands, you're going to have a file that was deleted and a file that was added. So in certain application scenarios where that change history for an individual XAML file for an individual class within your project, that is something that is not necessarily great that you would lose, because that change history, right? That might change and document, why did we do this? Why was my application set up in this way in the past? And making sure that we're able to keep that history and be able to move forward knowing, hey, this is why my application did what it was doing. This is why we changed it from this behavior to this behavior. Obviously, that change history is still there, but when you get 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road, oftentimes it can be really, really hard for you to look at the right way to go about finding that history. So where do we go from here? How do we make this upgrade process better? And that's really what I want to focus on here. Is Microsoft's got 3 outlined paths, right? The whole purpose here is to talk about the key takeaways of migrating from Xamarin.Forms. I needed to make sure you understood the options on the table. I'm going to show you now what works for us, what I've been able to do to successfully upgrade these projects and balance the pros and cons, be able to do this quickly, and being able to result in something that is beneficial, not only for the short term to get the job done, but for the long term to retain our change history, to retain our change tracking, and ultimately to get us where we need to go at the very end of the process. So what I have found is that combining these processes is where you get the best overall process for your organization. And so what I've done with this is you're really combining the use of the upgrade assistant in the manual migration process into the single project architecture. And the way that we're going to do this, or the way that I recommend doing this, is you use the upgrade assistant in side-by-side mode. What upgrade assistant does for you is it updates all of those individual find and replace items. It updates all of those namespaces. It updates all of those XAML files for you and your using statements and things like that inside of your individual classes. And it gets them ready for you to do what you need to do. So do that. Get it there. Don't worry if it compiles. Don't worry about everything being there, but have those things in place so you don't have to do it manually. And then utilize the manual single project process to set up a new project in your repository, do all of the things. But then when you go and do things, you can copy those files rather than using the source version, right? You can use the upgrade assistant. So when you bring something over into that project, let the upgrade assistant piece be the one that you bring over. You've copied that file content, which already has the namespaces updated, that already has the XAML indicators taken care of for you. And by doing this, you're leveraging the upgrade assistant for what it does well, which is the stuff that's absolute that every single developer has to do. But then you're doing the manual process of the things that require human intervention, where you need to actually look at the project, look at the namespaces, look at the packages that are necessary, and keep that project structure. As we take that one step, if we look at this process and compared to Upgrade Assistant by itself or our manual migration with the single project architecture, we typically have seen that this results in the shortest upgrade approach possible to get to that final perfect stance. So we're going to spend about 50% less manual effort by utilizing the upgrade assistant to take care of all of our find and replace options. The upgrade assistant is absolutely great at that, but we're still going to get into that single project architecture by being able to do this all on our own. So really an easy way to blend a couple of these processes together to result in something that's going to work well. As we move forward, though, there's still a couple things that we want to think about. Change history. I absolutely believe that change history is critical. And so one of the things that you can do as you're restructuring is play a little bit of a game. It's a little bit more manual, a little bit more tedious, but the use of get move and moving a file from one place to another without that file being marked as deleted and re-added becomes really an easy way, although tedious, to be able to keep that change history. So in the situation where you are able to do all of this, you would most likely take the existing XAML file that's in your existing project, move that process, move that file into the new single project architecture. Then, after it's been moved, update the file with the upgrade assistant. So a single move, and then you update. By doing this, you don't necessarily want to save that an intermediate step. You don't want to commit anything along the way. But this way, you can keep that change history. It's absolutely a manual step. It's a break in that chain. It's something that, if that history is important for you, it's important to understand what you're doing and how you're migrating. Images are your other big consideration. When you're combining, like I said, you need to make sure that you follow the image standards and sizes. Go out to the documentation, look at the Microsoft recommendations for the best image size to make sure that you pick the right asset from your existing solution. Make sure that you are able to have what you need to be able to do everything in your application, and only keep the ones that you need. As we look at the way that images are manipulated in .NET MAUI, SVGs are automatically converted to PNGs unless you do something different, and that's from a compatibility perspective. So it's important to make sure that you never try to load an SVG inside of your application. If your asset name is ends in .svg, it's not going to work. So a quick find and replace is something to look at there as well. It is important to understand that because of the single project architecture, you are needing to name your assets in a way that will work on all platforms, which means Android being the most restrictive standards should be utilized, where all of your images must be lowercase. They need to start and end with a letter, only containing alphanumeric characters or underscores. So any of your images, you may need to update those assets and then update your XAML files accordingly. It's also important to understand how the individual images are utilized within your .NET MAUI project. Since .NET MAUI is automatically resizing and adjusting the images for you, there is an ability to set a base size or a auto scale to convert those images to make sure you get consistent resizing expectations. So this is an example pulled from the documentation, but it's important to take a look at. Icon A indicates an image as it is uploaded that is 210 by 260 pixels. If you put that in out there and you don't make any changes, it will be scaled up or scaled down to fit the various device profiles as necessary based on that uploaded size. However, if you know that you need to get that image scaled up or down to a particular location, you can set a base size. That base size will take the image first from what you've uploaded, convert it to the base size, and then after that, it will scale that image out to the appropriate sizes. So this is where, as I mentioned, it's important to look at those images when you're bringing those over, where you want to make sure that you bring those over at the right sized image and look at base sizes. If you have some reason where you just want to leave an image until .NET MAUI, stop doing anything with this image, it is possible for you to simply say resize equals false inside of your project and stop that image from being resized. Now, automated builds are then kind of the final piece that a lot of folks ask about. The command lines are pretty darn similar. Almost all of the parameters, the things that you pass in for signing and everything else, those are going to stay basically the same. Prerequisite installation is really, really easy if you're running on an environment that may not have anything. .NET workload restore and the path to your project should be enough to be able to get all of the prerequisites installed if you're running on a machine that maybe doesn't have everything that you need. So a simple addition typically at the beginning of your builds, and making sure then you just pass the right moniker for that build. If you want to build for Android, make sure that you're passing in .NET 8.0 Android if you went to .NET 8, iOS, etc. Overall, from an automated build perspective, though, you should be fairly similar. All of the command line arguments, everything are documented. In all of our transitions, the automated builds have been really, really consistent overall. So with that, I wanted to open things up for the Q&A, and John, I'll pass back to you to help coordinate here.
Awesome. Let's see here. Let me. I just want to remind everybody that you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Let's see here. Let's see. Well, here's a pretty straightforward question to start with. Is it possible to migrate all projects to Maui?
At this point in time, originally there were features that were not there in parity. Now with .NET 8, if you look at the roadmap as outlined by Microsoft, everything looks to be there from a feature parity perspective. So there shouldn't be. Extra effort may be necessary if you had device-specific, plugins included, but there shouldn't be anything that you can't migrate to Maui.
Gotcha. Here's one from Shauna, who's wondering, when would you schedule this transition for your applications?
Guidance for clients at this point in time is that these migrations should be in your work schedule, not any later than first quarter of 2024, or at minimum at the end of second quarter. As much as the end of support date isn't a drop dead date, we know how quickly these app stores are moving. I think if we're being realistic, you probably have another 12 months after, but I don't have a lot of confidence that we will keep the build tooling working well beyond May. That is my personal opinion. It is not a guidance from Microsoft, but I'm a real big fan of trying to be done with things before end of support has been reached.
Very smart. Okay, here's one from Isaac, who's wondering, which is the best IDE for .NET MAUI development, VS or VS Code?
If you are a Windows developer, absolutely VS 2022 latest version is going to be your best experience. You get all of the fun things with hot reload and everything. Those of you that are Mac users, the dropping of support eventually for Visual Studio for Mac puts VS Code as being your IDE of choice if you are developing on a Mac.
Okay, so Mike is wondering, if I do not have a lot invested in Xamarin.Forms, what is the best path for me going forward toward Maui?
Honestly, if you don't have a lot in Xamarin, the migrations are easier. If you have smaller applications, it should be a lot easier. I think that the key for what's there in best path forward is, if you didn't do a lot with Xamarin.Forms and you don't necessarily have all of the ins and outs, I would strongly suggest go through the basic tutorial, start with the new apps to get an understanding of Maui and how to move your application forward. If you are a minimally invested developer in Xamarin.Forms and you're more of a web developer type that has to do some mobile development, I would strongly suggest also taking a look at .NET MAUI Blazor, the hybrid solution, because that may end up being a shorter learning curve from a development perspective. Now, your application is going to have to be redone when you're moving from Xamarin.Forms to .NET MAUI, but it might get you into the tool sets that are more familiar if you don't have a lot of investment from a Xamarin.Forms perspective.
Okay, here's one from Patrick, who's wondering, what about the data? Is there an impact to the data formats, encryption, etc.?
So all of the things that you were able to do before are able to be there. If you are using things like Xamarin Essentials to be able to access secure storage, you are still able to access that same secure storage with the same encryption process. So you should be able to move everything over. You're still running on .NET .NET 8. So everything that you were doing before, you should be able to still do. There is a slight transition note in the migration tools around secure storage, just to make sure that you keep those encryption pieces there, but no, you should be unaffected.
Okay, Brian wants to know, how does MAUI work with Azure DevOps pipelines, dev through deployment?
Yes, so everything with .NET MAUI is works in a similar manner. You can do the things you were able to do before with Xamarin.Forms, so you shouldn't really see much of a difference there. You have the ability, to automate the builds and everything else. And in our case, we actually automate build deployments straight to test flight, from an iOS perspective. The one thing that I think some people, if you are using App Center, there's a little bit, there from an automation perspective where App Center doesn't necessarily have the longest future. But you should be able to really take an existing DevOps pipeline and update it for any changes in commands and changes with workloads and move forward quickly.
Okay, here's one from regular attendee Lynn. Hi, Lynn. What future enhancements or features are planned for .NET MAUI, particularly those that may impact cross-platform game development?
So I don't have a ton of insight into the full roadmap other than, the public roadmap that's out there. I don't have a lot of information there, but I can do a little bit of digging. Feel free to, if you want, my contact information should be available. Feel free to reach out and I can try to dig up a couple links, but I don't know of anything, especially with cross-platform game stuff. Not sure if there's anything there.
Gotcha. Okay, Joseph is asking, whoops, question slipped away. There it is. How does this work for the app stores and app history? Can the MAUI version of the app, quote, look like, end quote, the Xamarin app as far as app ID, signing keys, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. So the app stores will have no real knowledge of any change. Your manifests are the same. How the manifest is built, how it's compiled, absolutely that process is different, but there's nothing, you're not going to get in trouble with the app stores. You're not going to, have a situation where the app stores think like, oh, this is a new app. All of those IDs are going to stay exactly the same.
Okay. Garrick is wondering, are the options the same in regular .NET projects? No Xamarin.Forms in my shop.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're just looking at the general going forward process from a just a .NET project, you absolutely can. If you're doing a new project and you're not coming from Xamarin.Forms, I wouldn't see any reason to develop any way other than a single project, especially because that single project type gets you Android, iOS, and Windows, which is the big thing. Xamarin.Forms was always Android and iOS only. Now you have the ability to target Windows and Mac. So I would just start the single project way and not even look at trying to make any of those other project types, if you will.
Okay. Here's one from Duke, who's wondering, how much time on average do you see it taking to upgrade to MAUI?
I think from a migration perspective, it really depends on exactly what your project look like. Applications that have less than say 10 or so forms, we've been able to do those in a matter of a day or two. It all depends on if you are bouncing against any of the known breaking changes. So taking a look at where you are, if you're on Xamarin.Forms 4 instead of 5, you're going to be looking at a longer upgrade process as well. So I would honestly say it's really, I think, best case scenario, a couple of days. Worst case scenario for us was about 4 weeks. For a project that was a little bit further behind and had a lot of those breaking changes. There's one other question out here, John, I'll kind of grab here as well. I'm going to reword it just a little bit. But Brian basically asked, what's the importance of mobile development when, everything can just run in a web browser? And I think that the key here is twofold, and we get two options when it looks at .NET MAUI. Ultimately, yes, everything can run on a web. You have progressive web apps, you have a lot of different things. But there is something to be said about that experience of being on device. And I think that that's where we really get things with MAUI. Being able to run on device allows you to better integrate with device features. So it's really from a mobile development perspective, you need to be providing something best of class. So accessing the GPS, accessing the compass information, NFC scanning, those kinds of things where you're looking to get into those devices, that's where the role of mobile, in my mind, really is. What's really powerful for those that are in the dev shop, but you're really, web dev shops, but you really need that extra bit. .NET MAUI Blazor, which is a option within the MAUI offerings where you're able to write a web interface but still do all of the on-device stuff, provides a really short transition period for developers along the way. So I think the key for me is absolutely looking at, what's your business use case and everything else. It is important to understand that through the app stores, there are minimum quality guidelines. So the iOS and Google stores do have an item in their acceptable requirements that you need to be doing something with your app that you can't do with a web application. They can sometimes choose to reject you. There's a lot of people that have obviously gotten through without that, but just know that it is an evaluation criteria in the stores.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mitchell. It looks like that's all the time we have for questions in this session. If we didn't get to your question, or if you think of one before the summit ends, enter it into the console and we'll pass it along to Mitchell. He's generously agreed to follow up. Thanks again to Mitchell Sellers for a great session, and to our sponsor, DevExpress, for making it possible. Now it's time for our second session, Ultimate Toolkit, Third-Party Integrations for .NET MAUI, led by 1105 Media Project Coordinator Kishana Dupuy.
And I'm so happy to be with us, to be with you all for our second and final session of the day. Some quick notes before we begin. We want to thank you for attending. Please be sure to stick around to the end, not only because you'll be eligible to win a $300 Amex gift card in our random drawing, but also because as you leave, you'll be asked to take a short survey with your opinions of this event. Please be sure to share your honest opinions, because our editors read every comment and they help shape our future events. And speaking of future events, we really want to take the time to thank our sponsor, DevExpress. They're sponsoring this event because they believe in the community and want to continue to support events like these. So please show your support and appreciation by downloading their resources, visiting their site, contacting them for a demo. It's through their underwriting of these events that we can bring more summits to you in the future. So again, thank you to DevExpress, thank you to our speakers, and thank you to you all for attending. Make sure you stay on for the prize drawing. With that, I am so thrilled to announce our speaker for our final session, Paul Usher, Technical Evangelist at DevExpress. Paul, please take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Paul Usher, a Technical Evangelist here at DevExpress, and we're thrilled to have the opportunity to connect with the community through this event. Here at DevExpress, we've been providing UI components all the way back since 1998. And we couldn't be more excited to be part of the transformative shift that's happening, especially around .NET MAUI. With our extensive experience, it's driven us to contribute to this dynamic ecosystem by developing a free set of comprehensive .NET MAUI controls. And yes, I mean free. We see the power in .NET MAUI, and we think that the components are going to help the community grow faster. You can download them today and start using them in your application straight away. No limitations. You just need to visit devexpress.com/MAUI to register and obtain your license, which is going to grant you access to the components indefinitely. Simply fill out your details, create an account if you don't already have one, review and accept the privacy policy and terms, and then you'll be granted access to your license, which will provide access to your NuGet key. I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the components and the key features that we include. Now, one of the things that we found, and I suppose a distinctive feature that sets our product line apart from others, is that our controls are wrappers around native high-performance mobile controls. So if you're developing for iOS, then the control that's going to be running on the device has been written in Objective-C. If you're developing for Android, the control you're going to see has been written in Kotlin and Java. Now, as you'd expect, our suite includes a data grid, a staple control that allows you to display, edit, and shape your data within your app. It's designed to be fast and address the typical usage scenarios, offering high performance, infinite scrolling, support for large data sets, fixed columns, row drag drop, and data exporting, along with so much more. If you're wanting a flexible way to display your data, look no further than the collection view. Now, we've chosen to create our own collection view designed specifically to deliver high performance by way of custom virtualization and a technique that we call cascade updates, which basically means that we're distributing the methods evenly across the UI thread. And it's going to grant you some exceptional scrolling performance. We've got full support for horizontal and vertical item presentation, infinite scrolling, filter UI, and again a ton of other things. We've got a set of charts which include over 22 different diverse chart types, your typical bar chart, pie chart, line charts. We offer support for financial charts and also some cool functionality around what you can do as far as interaction, such as crosshair cursors, tooltips, or providing summary information back to the user. Now, it'd be rude if I didn't mention the scheduler control. So if you're creating anything for event management, appointment-based or task management, then this control is going to save you a ton of time. We've got full support for data binding, appointment editing, recurring appointments, representation of multiple views such as day, week, work week, and of course month. You've got the ability to customize any of the forms, full time zone support, and an event reminder API. Of course, most of these controls are built around our editor components. So whether it's simple checkboxes, chip controls, autocomplete, on-demand data loading, or data based on previous user input, or even editor masks, we can help you validate details. You can utilize our data editor form, which automatically generates all of the editors and screen based on a bound data class. And with all of the controls that we're going to look at, all the editors are styled according to the newest Material Design 3 guidelines. We've got tabs and pop-ups. If it's a sheet that you want to display, maybe a confirmation dialog, a context menu, we provide some really easy tooling to drive that functionality. And if there's one thing that the DevExpress.NET MAUI team is really passionate about, it's the unwavering dedication to delivering a true mobile user experience. And if you've done any work in mobile development, you already understand that there's some nuances that have really got to be drawn out during that process. And we've worked hard to get rid of some of the desktop design patterns and implement user-friendly mobile interfaces. So if you're shifting from desktop to mobile, you'll be surprised just how important some controls like the button sheet might be for your application. We've introduced the bottom drawer sheet and the shimmer view. If your application has got to go off to a REST API to grab some data, you still want the user to know something's happening. And you might have experienced this in other applications such as Facebook, where the page is displayed with a shadow whilst that data is loaded. Now, one of the things that we've done to help kickstart your development journey is to introduce Visual Studio Extension with project templates. And these templates streamline your workflow. They're going to automatically register the DevExpress handlers. They're going to add the relevant namespaces and incorporate any NuGet packages based on your selection. All you need to do is simply install the extension, create a new Visual Studio project, and then you'll have the flexibility to select different layouts on control sets. Once you've registered for your free license, you're going to have access to your personalized DevExpress NuGet feed. Then jump over to our Getting Started area on the website, which has got step-by-step instructions on how to set up your very first .NET MAUI project using the DevExpress controls. Also on the website is a featured scenarios area with comprehensive examples on many different real-world scenarios and what you need to do to implement those into your application, complete with full source control and instructions on how to implement them. All of the controls that I've talked about so far, you can actually explore yourself in our demo application. You can download the app straight from the Google Play Store, or if you're working with iOS, you can download the source code from my GitHub repo, compile and run it on your device. We'll spend a couple of minutes just looking through that application running on an emulator. Once you've installed the application, launch it, and you're going to see the DevExpress mobile UI app. The first thing I want to call out is the fact that all the controls conform to that material design guideline. You can change the theming of your project by simply setting a base color. Here we can see an example of implementing that. Working with either the light or dark mode on your operating system. Once you apply that, that base theme will apply to all of the controls in the collection. We take a quick look at the grid. We can see here an example of grouping. We're grouping by position title, and as I scroll through, I've got the ability of implementing a single-click sort. I can scroll through the data horizontally, vertically. We can note that in this case we've got a fixed column for the employee name. With a couple of lines of code, you can export that data to any standard file format that you want. As you explore the demo application, you can look around and experience all of the key features and functions. Everything from how to implement fixed panels with grouping, cell level editing, the automatic filter row, how to implement swipe gestures into your grid, virtual scrolling, pull to refresh. You'll notice for each of the demos, there's a standard and advanced feature. Here we can see how to implement things such as drag drop, build custom appearances, implement automatic row heights, work with real-time data, or even an infinite data source. We step into the collection view, and you can see how to use the built-in filtering UI. Here's a complex list, implementing the filters, whether it be chips, numeric editors, or even a drill down into a specific filter list. If I just select Texas, select, we can see that information is fed back to the filter UI and then back into our list. If we just consider that one feature for a second, you may consider it's quite complex to implement. But if we actually take a look at the code, in actual fact, we can see from the markup that we simply need to create a data template where we can implement the filter items. The control is going to do all the heavy lifting behind the scenes at that point. If you're wanting to implement CRUD operations, the collection view has got the smarts built in to simplify that process for you. Here we've got a contacts list. I select a contact. The form is built based on the data object. If I implement the editor view, the editor views are implemented by the data object, including support for validation, so I can't go back past that screen until I correct that validation, ensuring the data that's being passed back is always valid. One of the newer controls that's just made the latest version is the built-in PDF viewer. No longer do you have to try and use a web view or go out to a web browser to view a PDF file. It's available directly within our control set. There's so many components and controls to experiment with. The best thing you can do is head over to devexpress.com/Maui, download your free copy today, and start experimenting. I hope this quickfire session has been able to give you some example of the power of the controls that we're offering for .NET MAUI. Feel free to reach out on any of our socials. There's a direct contact for myself, and of course head over to devexpress.com/Maui to register for your copy of our free components.
Thank you so much, Paul. We have a few questions here, but attendees, I will remind you to continue putting your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. All right, this first one says, thanks, Paul. Is the DevExpress.NET MAUI suite free for commercial use?
Absolutely. All of the DevExpress MAUI controls are available free of charge. And when you register for that product, you can continue to use that registered product indefinitely. And should we provide an update, the update will be made free of charge. You'll be notified by email or the website, and you can continue to use that update indefinitely. So there's no limit around the offerings that we've put forward there.
Nice. Next one's, what IDEs can I use for .MAUI controls, for your .MAUI controls?
Okay, so this covers all of the offerings in the .NET MAUI platform. Noting from the previous speaker as well, if you're using Windows, then the obvious go-to is Visual Studio. As a longtime Mac user, I loved using Visual Studio for Mac. So noting that that's been retired, I've moved over now to VS Code, which has been a phenomenal shift, especially with some of the plugins available, such as .NET Meteor, to just streamline that processing back end. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of people out there screaming at me right now. Don't forget to mention Rider, which I've also used. So pretty much, yeah, Visual Studio, VS Code, and for the Rider fans, Rider.
Are the controls available from MAUI Blazor Hybrid?
So you can use the controls inside the hybrid application, absolutely. Obviously, we also have a set of controls specifically for Blazor, so there's more information there on the website. Again, picking up on one of the questions that was asked before, as to, should you be using PWA or progressive web apps versus developing for mobile? One thing that was sort of not mentioned was the multi-threading options for direct mobile development as well. So yeah, really comes down to that need requirement, but we do support Blazor development.
And are there any differences using the DevExpress controls in Visual Studio versus Visual Code?
Not whatsoever. The idea itself isn't going to make a difference as to how the controls get used. It's standard markup. You're registering your namespaces, setting up your handlers, and off you go. The getting started area that I mentioned in the presentation there has got some really good examples of how to do that. And quite often I switch between my IDs. So at the moment I'm still using VS for Mac and then switch over to VS Code. So it really, it's a seamless process. Even jumping back to a Windows machine, that's the nice thing with this ecosystem.
What image control IIB support camera image capture? Will image control support it?
So the new image control does definitely support the capturing of your image from the camera control, yes, as well as, so we support obviously photo library and live image capture from camera.
All right, let me know if you can tackle this one, Paul, if we need to get back to them at another time. I noticed on the free offer page that the free MAUI controls offered are limited to the versions listed. If those versions become depreciated in a subsequent version of iOS or Android, will we need to pay for newer versions to keep our apps compliant, or will the newer versions be free as well? That was a big one there.
It's a great question from Matthew, so thanks for that. Look, the idea, and if you followed along any of our product lines over the years, the Xamarin controls that we released were still available free of charge when we switched to .NET MAUI. And from our perspective, it's about providing that support into the community. So there's going to be continuous improvements on the controls. I don't have a crystal ball to say that in X number of years, the components are going to switch to a paid model. Obviously, moving down the track, there's going to be a point if Apple decide a certain API is deprecated and it's no longer supported, who knows? But it's our intention to always continue to support the products that we put out there and the community behind it.
We have time for 2 more questions. Do you have a control that handles barcode scanning?
Not inside our libraries. There is definitely a couple already out there and available just via NuGet feeds. I actually used one in a personal pet project and had beautiful results from it. So not one that's in our quiver, so to speak.
Thank you. And this one is from me, Paul. What are some good next steps for our attendees if they would like to learn more? I know you touched on it in the video, but if you could just remind us on what we can do next.
Absolutely. Look, we provided some URLs that I think you're going to make available. The best starting place is devexpress.com, specifically for Maui, then just devexpress.com/Maui. There's a getting started link. There's a link to our training videos. The Help Center has got just a plethora of support documents and features for getting started. And really the best thing to do is just register for your copy of the controls and hit that first new project. Start playing around. There's so much available and so much that you can implement, and it's a lot of fun. It really is.
We are out of time, but genuinely thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today and tackling all of those questions, and for your lovely demo presentation. Again, if you have more questions, thank you. If you have more questions, continue to put them into the Q&A box and we'll be sure to share them with the DevExpress team. And now, for the exciting part of the end of our session, we are going to announce the winner of our random drawing. Drum roll, drum roll. The winner is Emrit Khalsa of GXM. Congratulations to you. You have won the $300 Amex gift card. Our team will be in touch with you on how to claim your prize. That is it for today's summit. Thank you all so much for attending. You will receive the replay email in your inbox within the next few days. We really hope you enjoy the event. Please take the survey that pops up as you exit. Thank you to Paul for joining us, Mitchell, John, and again to DevExpress. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.